Good evening, traveler of stories and seeker of dreams. Tonight, I invite you to leave behind the noise of the day and step into the heat-hazed heart of Australia, a land where red sands stretch to the horizon and the whispers of lost gold echo on the wind. Our journey leads us deep into the myth of Lasseter's Reef, a legendary motherlode of unimaginable wealth, hidden, perhaps forever, in the brutal vastness of the Outback. Some called it Australia's El Dorado, others a fool's mirage, but for over a century, people have chased its shimmer, and not all returned. Before we drift into the desert of legend, take a moment to gently tap that like button and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. That way, you won't miss the next story waiting just beyond the horizon. Now, let your body sink into comfort. Let the world fade. And let me guide you into a tale of mystery, obsession, and the unforgiving heart of the land down under. Close your eyes if you like. The story is about to begin. There's a silence in the Red Centre that speaks louder than thunder. Not an empty silence, but a living one, stretched across ochre plains, hummed through ghost gums, and baked into the bones of the desert. It's the kind of silence that draws people in and holds them tight, a silence that both soothes and unsettles. This is the heart of Australia, the centre, not just in geography, but in spirit. Here the land is ancient beyond reckoning. The sand underfoot has been red for more than 200 million years. The winds have blown the same dust over Aboriginal songlines, over explorer trails, over wrecked camels and rusted jerry cans. It is beautiful, it is brutal, and it is where the legend of Lasseter's Reef begins. The 20th century was still young when whispers began to curl out of the desert. Whispers of a golden reef so rich it defied imagination. But before gold fever could take root, one had to reach this land, and that was no easy feat. In those early decades, the Red Centre was a place few white Australians had ever seen, let alone understood. For most, it might as well have been the far side of the moon. Roads were suggestions, rivers were dry for most of the year, and if your water ran out, so did your chances. Temperatures soared to over 45 degrees Celsius, and shade was often as valuable as gold itself. It wasn't empty, though, far from it. The Western Desert, Gibson Desert, and McDonnell Ranges were home to rich Aboriginal cultures who had lived with and respected the land for tens of thousands of years. To them, the desert wasn't hostile, it was home. It spoke, if you knew how to listen, and it remembered. Yet the newcomers, settlers, prospectors, surveyors, often didn't listen, or couldn't. To them, this vast inland expanse was a final frontier, a land of fortune and mystery. They came with maps that had more blanks than markings, with water bags slung from dusty horses, and dreams of striking it rich. The Red Centre had already played host to earlier gold rushes, from Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory to the Coolgardie fields further west. Australia, by the early 1900s, had become one of the world's leading gold producers. It had already made men millionaires and towns from nothing. So when word spread that there might be a hidden reef of gold, untouched, unclaimed, and almost mythical in scale, it didn't take long for the dreamers to start listening. But unlike the goldfields of Victoria or New South Wales, this was not a place with saloons and surveyors, post offices and banks. The desert offered no handrails, no certainty. What it gave, it could take back just as easily. And that's where Harold Lasseter enters the tale, a man whose name would become inseparable from this land, even if many believe he never truly belonged to it. Lasseter claimed he had once seen the reef, not in a dream, but in his youth, during a time when he was alone, lost, and saved by indigenous people after his horse gave out. He described it vividly: quartz veins the size of a man's arm, laced with pure gold. He said he'd taken samples, said he'd marked the place, said he could return. But before that journey, before Lasseter's bold claims and tragic end, there was the land, unmoved, unchanging, waiting. And as every story rooted in this desert teaches us, the land always has the final word. The McDonnell Ranges, flanked by ghost gums and ancient rock faces, reach across central Australia like the spine of a dreaming serpent. Alice Springs, known then as Stewart, was little more than a telegraph station and a few shacks. The railway hadn't yet crossed the center. To go deeper meant camel caravans, trackers, and hope. As the sun would rise each morning, it painted the desert in fire, turning every rock into gold just for a moment. And perhaps it's in that moment, when the earth itself seemed gilded by the gods, that the idea of a golden reef didn't seem so impossible. But to find it, that would take more than hope. It would take belief, obsession, and eventually sacrifice. In the years to come, men would die chasing the promise of Lasseter's reef. Fortunes would be spent and lost. Helicopters, drones, and satellites would sweep the land in grids. But in this beginning, in the stillness of the early 1900s, all that existed was the possibility, the whisper, the hunch that something was out there. As the desert cooled with nightfall and dingoes called across the dunes, the Red Centre didn't answer. It never does, but it watches, and those who step into its domain soon learn. You do not seek treasure from this land, you earn it, sometimes with sweat, sometimes with blood, always with everything. Now that the scene is set and the land has welcomed us, we're ready to meet the man at the center of it all. Harold Lasseter, a man and his vision. He was not a man of the Outback, not in the way that drovers, swagmen, or bushrangers were. Harold Bell Lasseter was a dreamer, a man of ideas, not soil. He did not grow up riding across red plains or sleeping beneath the Southern Cross. Yet somehow, his name would become one of the most enduring in Australian desert lore. Born in the year 1880 in Bamgani, Victoria, Harold Bell Lasseter's early life was not one that foretold legend. His family was not wealthy. He had a modest education and, by most accounts, little patience for formal learning. What he did possess, however, was a restless spirit and a boundless imagination. He left home young, drifting across the country in search of work, adventure, and perhaps something more elusive, a sense of meaning. Like many of his generation, Lasseter wore many hats. He worked as a laborer, a shearer, and a handyman. At one point, he even dabbled in architecture. He had an uncanny ability to talk himself into, and often out of, positions. To some, he was charming and persuasive. To others, he was a liar. Perhaps both views held truth. What is clear is that Harold Lasseter was not satisfied with the ordinary. He was drawn to the big idea, the dramatic claim, the story that could shift fate itself. And in time, he would find his greatest story in the form of a golden reef, lost in the sands of Central Australia. Lasseter claimed that in his youth, sometime between the late 1890s and the turn of the century, he had been traveling alone through the desert country when disaster struck. His horse had collapsed, leaving him stranded. He wandered, disoriented and dehydrated, until he was reportedly rescued by an Aboriginal group who nursed him back to health. It was during this fateful ordeal, he later claimed, that he stumbled across a quartz outcrop gleaming with gold. It was not a mere trace, not specks or flakes, but thick veins of yellow metal running like lightning through white stone. He took samples, he marked the location, and then he left, certain he could find his way back when the time was right. But the desert is a shapeshifter, without precise coordinates, without maps or landmarks that hold still. Retracing your steps in the Red Centre is like finding the same mirage twice. For decades, Lasseter's golden memory remained just that, a memory, a story he told, but few believed. Throughout the early 20th century, Lasseter drifted. He married, raised children, and held a series of odd jobs. He served briefly in the military during the First World War, though even his records there reflect some inconsistencies in age and details. Wherever he went, the story of the Reef followed him like a shadow, a tale he offered up in pubs, letters, and conversations, sometimes with subtle changes, other times with renewed urgency. It was not until the late 1920s that he truly began to push his claim. With Australia still reeling from the Great Depression, the idea of a rich gold find had powerful appeal. Lasseter began writing letters to government officials, mining companies, and wealthy patrons. He argued that the reef he had found could be the salvation of the nation, a source of wealth to rival Kalgoorlie or Ballarat. Most ignored him. Some mocked him, but a few listened. One of those who took an interest was John Bailey, a prominent figure associated with the Australian Workers' Union and a member of the Australian government. Bailey was no fool, but he was also not immune to hope. Australia's interior remained largely unexplored, and stranger claims had been proven true before. With the economy in dire straits and Lasseter's story just plausible enough, Bailey and others helped organize an expedition. In early 1930, the Central Australian Gold Exploration Company was formed. Backed by a mix of public and private interest, the expedition was intended to either prove or disprove Lasseter's claim once and for all. And so, Harold Lasseter was given the opportunity he had waited for most of his adult life. He would return to the desert, this time not as a lone wanderer, but as the leader of a full-scale mission. Aircraft, camels, vehicles, and supplies were secured. A small team was assembled, and all eyes turned to the desert. But even before the journey began, there were signs of trouble. Lasseter had no precise coordinates, only a memory that had aged 30 years. He was vague about landmarks and inconsistent in his descriptions. He did not get along with others easily. Many in the party questioned his leadership, his knowledge of the bush, and his temperament. He was a man of vision, yes, but he was no bushman, and yet he believed, fiercely, unshakably, to the point of stubbornness. For Harold Lasseter, this was more than a quest for gold. It was a matter of honor, of redemption. For years he had been dismissed as a fantasist, even a fraud. Now he would prove them all wrong. He would show the nation, and perhaps the world, that the reef was real. In his writings and diaries, a complex man emerges. He was proud, defiant, often poetic. He spoke of destiny, of being chosen. He saw himself not merely as a prospector, but as a bearer of great truth. That belief would carry him deep into the Outback, and eventually to his death. By the time the expedition set out in July of 1930, Harold Lasseter was 50 years old. His beard had grayed. His health was not robust, but his eyes still burned with conviction. He had waited half a lifetime for this chance, and nothing, not the doubts of others, not the merciless desert, not even the risk of death, would stop him now. Next, we'll follow Lasseter and his team into the searing heart of the Outback, the Fabled Discovery. They set out from Alice Springs in the winter of 1930. The sky above them was a pale, unforgiving blue. The wind came dry and steady from the west, stirring the dust into low, curling ghosts. The expedition was grand by Outback standards. a mix of trucks, camels, bushmen, and aviation support. At the center of it all stood Harold Lasseter, ready to lead them toward a place only he could remember. The Central Australian Gold Exploration Company had spared no effort. The plan was ambitious: a motorized convoy from Alice Springs to the Petermann Ranges, with support from an aircraft to scout ahead and drop supplies. A team of men was assembled, each with different skills. There was Fred Blakely, a seasoned prospector and bushman who viewed Lasseter with immediate skepticism. Blakely had spent his life in the Outback and had little time for what he saw as tall tales. Also present was Errol Coote, a pilot and reporter, brought in to capture the drama from the sky and keep the public informed. From the beginning, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Lasseter did not fit in. He was awkward in the bush. He lacked the easy camaraderie of men used to rough work and long silences. And most damning of all, he was evasive about the exact location of the reef. He spoke in vague terms, gestured broadly across the map, and when asked to be more precise, he offered poetic generalities about landmarks long changed by time and erosion. Still, they pressed on. The trucks struggled early, bogged in sand or broken by the brutal terrain. The camels fared better, guided by Afghan cameleers with deep knowledge of the land. The aircraft, too, faced difficulties. Its role in resupply quickly proved unreliable due to weather and technical limitations. In the desert, every plan bends or breaks. As the days wore on, trust in Lasseter eroded. Blakely grew vocal in his doubts. Others followed. Lasseter remained firm. He insisted he knew where he was going, that they were close, that the reef was waiting. Then, somewhere near the Petermann Ranges, a rugged remote line of hills straddling the Northern Territory and Western Australia, Lasseter declared that the reef was near. He pointed toward a jumble of weather-worn hills, their shadows long in the afternoon sun. "There," he is said to have told the group. "It's just there." But no reef appeared. They searched the area for days. Lasseter grew increasingly agitated. He argued with Blakely, withdrew from the group, and insisted they were standing on gold without seeing it. The others, exhausted and low on supplies, began to speak of turning back. Finally, the expedition fractured. Blakely and the main party made the decision to return to Alice Springs. Lasseter, furious and determined, refused to give up. He convinced a dingo shooter named Paul Johns, a rough bushman with camels and supplies, to accompany him deeper into the wilds. They vanished westward, toward the Warburton Ranges, into land even less mapped and more merciless. What happened next has become the stuff of legend. Lasseter and Johns traveled together for a short time, but clashed almost immediately. Lasseter's health was deteriorating. He was thin, sunburned, and his feet were blistered from walking through spinifex and stone. Johns, growing wary of the situation, eventually left Lasseter near the Hull River, refusing to go further with a man he considered unwell and possibly mad. Now alone, Lasseter pressed on. He wrote in his diary, a now famous record of his final days, of rediscovering the reef. He claimed to have found it again, just as he remembered. The quartz was there, the gold unmistakable. But he was weak, unable to carry samples, and running out of food. His diary is filled with longing, hope, and despair in equal measure. He made several attempts to travel on foot, hoping to find help, but each time he was forced to return. Hunger gnawed at him. His camel bolted. His supplies dwindled. The desert, indifferent to his dreams, began to close in. In his final entries, Lasseter wrote of building a shelter in a cave. He still believed salvation was possible. He still hoped that someone would come. but no one did. Eventually, a group of Pitjantjatjara people found him. He was gaunt, delirious, and barely alive. They gave him water, offered what food they could, and tried to assist him. But his condition was too far gone. He died shortly after, buried in a shallow grave near the Hull River. Later, a search party recovered his body, as well as his diary, worn, weather-stained, and full of the words of a man who had come so far, only to die so close to his dream. The fabled discovery, then, remains a paradox. According to his final writings, Lasseter found the reef, but no one else ever saw it. No samples were brought back, no coordinates marked, and over the years, the shifting sands have offered nothing but silence in return. Some believe he truly rediscovered it, his vision finally vindicated in death. Others argue he was hallucinating, undone by sunstroke and desperation. Still others suggest he invented the entire tale from the beginning, a grand con, or perhaps a delusion he convinced himself was real. But whatever the truth, one fact remains undeniable. Harold Lasseter died chasing gold in one of the most remote parts of the Australian continent. He believed until the very end, and sometimes belief alone is enough to make a legend. Next, we will follow Lasseter's doomed attempt to return and the unraveling of trust that led him to walk into the wilderness alone, lost in the sand, a return in vain. When Harold Lasseter returned from the desert in the late 1920s, he carried something more than sunburn and exhaustion. He carried a secret, or so he claimed. He had been to the reef, had seen it again with his own eyes. He spoke of glittering gold-streaked quartz, of wide, untapped veins buried deep within the red rock. But what he did not carry was proof. No samples, no maps, no photographs, just memory. To the seasoned bushman of the time, this was little better than fantasy. But for Lasseter, it was conviction. He wrote letters, dozens of them, to politicians, to newspapers, to mining syndicates. His tone was measured at first, hopeful, insistent. But as time wore on and rejection mounted, his letters became more urgent, even desperate. He believed, utterly and completely, that he alone held the key to Australia's greatest treasure. The year was approaching 1930, and the world was slipping into the jaws of economic depression. Families queued for bread. Farmers watched crops turn to dust. A fortune buried in the heart of the country, if it existed, could offer salvation, or at least distraction. Lasseter began to find ears willing to listen. The Central Australian Gold Exploration Company was formed. Investors pooled funds. Equipment was purchased. The press took notice, calling it a bold and daring venture into the unknown. In public, Lasseter stood as a visionary. In private, he bore the weight of expectation like a yoke. But behind the spectacle, uncertainty grew. When pressed for coordinates, Lasseter hesitated. He cited the unreliability of early surveying instruments, claimed shifting sand and time had distorted the landscape. He insisted that he could lead them there, not by map, but by memory. This would be his return, the great vindication, the moment where disbelief would be replaced by gold. But the desert, as always, had other plans. The expedition departed from Alice Springs in mid-1930. As we saw earlier, the party fractured. Arguments sparked like flint in dry grass. Equipment failed. Camels resisted the whip. Eventually, Lasseter continued alone, or nearly alone, with only the reluctant company of Paul Johns. But now we focus on what happened after that. After even Johns turned back. After Lasseter, driven by pride, belief, or something darker, chose to press on, deeper into the unforgiving inland. He had with him meager supplies, a small amount of food, a water bag, and a pack of letters and documents tied together in oilskin. He had no radio, no map, no certainty, only the reef in his mind and the promise that he would return with gold. It was during this stage that he believed he rediscovered the reef. He wrote in his diary that he had found it again. The same formation, the same golden gleam. His words brimmed with triumph. But even then, there was tragedy folded within the lines. He was too weak to take samples. He lacked the tools to extract even a fragment. And most devastating of all, he had no means of telling anyone. His camel bolted shortly after. Whether frightened or simply following instinct, the beast disappeared into the spinifex, taking with it most of Lasseter's remaining supplies. He was left with a few possessions, the clothes on his back, and a vast horizon closing in on all sides. The tone of his diary shifted then. The certainty of discovery gave way to the slow erosion of reality. He tried to walk out, made several attempts in fact, but the distances were enormous, the heat unbearable. His strength waned. He built a shelter in a shallow cave carved into the flank of a low hill. There, he continued to write. He described the shape of the reef, the direction of hills. He mused on the failure of men to believe him, on the incompetence of those who had turned back. He wrote of betrayal, of vision, of fate. But mostly he wrote to stave off despair. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only the desert can offer. Not just isolation, but the realization that the world will continue without you. The stars turn, the winds blow, and the sand forgets your name. It's said that in those final weeks, Lasseter began speaking aloud to himself, that his voice echoed off the rocks like a man calling into a void. Sometime later, perhaps days, perhaps a week, a group of Pitjantjatjara people came across him. They were experienced desert dwellers, used to surviving where others perished. They gave him food, offered him water, and observed his strange behavior with concern. Lasseter attempted to communicate. He showed them the direction of the reef, begged for help to return to it. But he was too weak, and they were too wary. In their culture, the land was sacred, not a thing to be carved and mined. They could help the man. They could not help the mission. They left him with food and returned later to find his body still, his spirit gone. Word traveled slowly back to Alice Springs. When the recovery team finally reached the area, they found a shallow grave, a few personal belongings, and the diary, battered, tear-stained, but intact. It became the heart of the legend. Lasseter had returned, in body, if not in gold. He had gone back into the sand in search of a dream, and there, the dream had swallowed him. To this day, many argue over what really happened. Did Lasseter ever find the reef again? Was it all a fabrication? Was he, in the end, a con man or a true believer lost in his own myth? There are no easy answers. What remains is this: a man walked into the desert because he believed in something bigger than himself. And whether he was right or wrong, the Outback claimed him all the same. Next, we follow the story of the 1930 expedition itself, a mission marked by mistrust, hardship, and the unforgiving weight of the land. The 1930 expedition. The year was 1930. Australia, like much of the world, was in the tightening grip of the Great Depression. Work was scarce. Cities simmered with frustration. Out in the bush, dust rose from the backs of cattle and wagons, but money, like water, was drying up fast. Against this backdrop of hardship and hope, a tale emerged that gripped the nation, a mysterious gold reef lost somewhere in the heart of the continent, vast beyond imagination. Harold Lasseter's claim had become more than just a prospector's dream. It was national news. His story had been picked up by the press, printed in bold headlines across Sydney and Melbourne. The Reef, he said, lay somewhere in the desert ranges of Central Australia, a rich deposit stretching for kilometres, just waiting to be found. To some, it was Australia's El Dorado. To others, it was madness. But madness or not, it stirred something. Men who had never ventured more than a few miles from the coast found themselves reading maps. Investors with more optimism than sense saw opportunity, and among the political elite, some saw a chance to distract the public from economic gloom with an outback adventure that, if successful, could rewrite the fortunes of the nation. Thus, the Central Australian Gold Exploration Company was formed. Headquartered in Sydney, the company was a mix of businessmen, politicians, and enthusiasts. They raised funds from shareholders and poured them into what would become one of the most ambitious and controversial expeditions in the country's history. It was a strange mix of science, showmanship, and speculation. Harold Lasseter, now in his 50s, was positioned as both guide and visionary. The man who had once stumbled across a golden miracle was now the key to unlocking it again. But those who met him in person noticed something odd. He was vague, forgetful at times, resistant to detail. He carried himself with the conviction of a prophet, but struggled to answer the simplest logistical questions. Still, the wheels were in motion. By mid-year, the expedition was ready. The plan was to travel from Alice Springs, then known as Stewart, westward toward the Petermann Ranges. The main convoy would consist of several vehicles, trucks fitted for desert travel, laden with fuel, water, and supplies. A support aircraft would be flown in, piloted by Errol Coote, a young airman and journalist whose dual role was to scout the route and report back to the world. Also included in the party was Fred Blakely, a veteran bushman and prospector who would soon become one of Lasseter's most vocal critics. Blakely had crossed the Outback on horseback, knew the land better than most, and had little patience for what he saw as storytelling. From the start, problems began to emerge. The trucks, unsuited to the loose red sand, bogged frequently. Axles snapped, radiators overheated. Spare parts became currency more valuable than gold. The desert was merciless. Dust blew like fine powder, choking engines and eyes alike. The sun scorched down from above, while the earth radiated heat from below. Lasseter, meanwhile, failed to inspire confidence. He seemed unfamiliar with bush survival. He couldn't shoot, track, or even navigate effectively. Blakely noted in his journal that Lasseter struggled to read the landscape, not just physically, but spiritually. He did not move like a man who belonged. The aircraft, too, proved problematic. Designed for flat paddocks, it was ill-suited to desert landings. Fuel had to be rationed. Mechanical failures were frequent. On more than one occasion, the pilot and crew were forced to make emergency landings and camp overnight in the sand, far from help. Despite the setbacks, the team pressed on. Each morning began early, with campfires lit beneath the ghost gums and billy cans boiled for tea. Camels, more reliable than trucks, were loaded with supplies and led by Afghan cameleers, men whose presence was essential but rarely celebrated. Their knowledge of the desert, handed down over generations, helped the expedition stay alive. But as the days stretched into weeks, tempers flared. Lasseter's directions were inconsistent. He pointed toward hills that did not exist. He described valleys that the team never encountered. The further they traveled, the more his credibility eroded. Blakely, increasingly frustrated, began to document his doubts in detail. He accused Lasseter of misleading the party, of endangering lives with fantasy. At one point, Lasseter vanished for a short while, claiming he had gone scouting ahead. When he returned, he announced that they were close, within days of the Reef. But when asked to prove it, he faltered. Blakely, now convinced of fraud, called for the expedition to be aborted. In the official report later filed by the company, Blakely described the mission as a disaster. He criticized the planning, the equipment, and most of all, Lasseter. "A man who belongs in a hospital," he wrote, "not the desert." But Lasseter would not give up. When the rest of the expedition turned back toward Alice Springs, Lasseter struck out alone, with the reluctant aid of Paul Johns, a dingo shooter who knew the country and had a string of camels. This moment, when the party split, is often marked as the line between hope and tragedy. While the others returned, worn down and bitter, Lasseter ventured deeper. Westward, toward the Warburton Ranges, he wrote in his diary that he had never been more sure, that the Reef was near, that redemption was close enough to touch. But out there, belief alone would not be enough. John soon left him, unable to tolerate the chaos of Lasseter's wandering and growing instability. Alone now, Lasseter faced the desert with little more than memory and faith. It would be his final journey. The 1930 expedition, in the end, produced no gold, but it did produce something else: legend. It became a national tale of obsession, failure, and the terrible power of belief. And it sparked a chain of events that would ripple through Australian history for decades. Next, we follow the breaking point, the descent into isolation, madness, and the final tragic days of a man who chased gold into the heart of a land that offers no mercy. Madness and Mirage. The Outback does not scream, it whispers, and it whispers slowly across endless days of heat and silence until the mind begins to bend. Out here, madness does not come in fits. It creeps, like the cool breath of a willy-willy sliding across the sand, unnoticed until it's already around your neck. After the failure of the main party, Harold Lasseter was left alone with his obsession. He had convinced Paul Johns, a rough-edged dingo shooter and cameleer, to accompany him deeper into the desert. Johns was no fool. He knew the terrain. He had seen men die out here, caught between thirst and hope. But Lasseter paid well, and money still mattered, even in madness. For a time they traveled westward, their camels plodding silently across the burning plains. The Peterman Ranges fell behind them, replaced by the strange silence of the Warburton country. Flat, endless stretches of spinifex and gravel, the occasional dry creek bed, a sun so relentless it bleached even the bones of lizards. At first, Lasseter was driven. He walked with purpose, scribbled in his notebook, pointed at distant ranges with shaking hands. He told Johns they were close, days, perhaps hours, from a reef the size of a hill streaked with gold. He spoke of quartz so rich it gleamed underfoot, of nuggets big enough to choke a billy can. But Johns wasn't buying it. He grew more and more uneasy. The directions didn't make sense. Lasseter would lead them in one direction for hours, only to double back or stop suddenly. His behavior shifted, from manic bursts of energy to sudden, eerie silence. He began to speak to himself at night, staring into the fire with glassy eyes. The two men argued constantly. Johns, hardened by years in the bush, accused Lasseter of leading them into nothing. Lasseter, in turn, accused Johns of cowardice, of betrayal. Their food supplies began to dwindle. The heat beat down with unrelenting weight. Finally, somewhere near the Hull River, Johns had enough. He told Lasseter he was heading back. that no gold was worth dying in the middle of nowhere for. Lasseter, true to his nature, refused to turn around. He claimed they were on the brink of discovery, that Johns would regret leaving, that history would remember him as the man who walked away from greatness. Johns packed up his camels and vanished into the horizon, and so began Lasseter's descent into solitude. Now utterly alone, he set up camp near a low ridge. He used branches and stones to build a crude shelter beneath an overhang, a shallow cave that offered meager protection from the searing sun. There he lived, or tried to. In his diary, found later by rescuers, his words begin clearly, even optimistically. He claimed to have found the reef. Again, this time he was certain. "It is here," he wrote, "as I always said it was. The quartz is thick, the gold heavy." But there were no samples, no coordinates, no sketches, just words, born of hope or hallucination. He tried to walk out, once, maybe twice. His diary mentions 3 false starts. Each time, the desert beat him back. He ran low on water, his feet blistered, his strength faded. He returned to the cave and waited, not for help, perhaps, but for clarity. As the days passed, his entries became fragmented. He wrote about the sun circling him, about the earth breathing, about figures on the horizon, aboriginal spirits, or mirages, or ghosts. He began addressing people who weren't there, apologizing, accusing, pleading. At one point, he scrawled a message, "Forgive me, I did what I could." This is where fact and interpretation blur. Some argue Lasseter was experiencing sunstroke, his mind breaking beneath the twin pressures of heat and hope. Others believe he had truly rediscovered the reef, but was physically unable to secure proof. Still others believe the entire diary was a final performance, a man writing not for survival, but for legacy. Eventually, he could no longer write. When members of the Pitjantjatjara people found him, he was gaunt, burnt, and barely conscious. They gave him water, shared what food they had, observed his strange, erratic behavior. He tried to explain himself, pointing toward the distant hills, muttering about gold and betrayal. They listened, but they did not understand. To them, the land was not a thing to be conquered. It was alive, sacred. It was not theirs to give. They offered care, shelter, but it was too late. Lasseter died soon after, quietly, without drama. The land that had obsessed him for decades claimed him in silence. His grave was shallow, marked with a simple wooden cross. Years later, his body was recovered and reburied. But that simple spot, out in the middle of nothing, remains a monument to a dream too heavy for one man to carry. His diary was found nearby, stained, sun-bleached, but intact. It told a story not of gold, but of obsession, not of wealth, but of the thin line between vision and delusion. In those final pages, Lasseter became more than a prospector. He became a parable. To this day, no one has definitively found Lasseter's reef, but his story lives on, not in gold, but in the grit of men who walk into the desert chasing something more than metal. Next, we turn to that very diary, the document that gave voice to a dead man and breathed new life into a legend many thought buried with him. The diary speaks. It was a small thing, really, a tattered oilskin bundle, half buried beneath the red sand and scorched leaves near a makeshift bush shelter. The final possessions of a man who had walked into the Outback with a vision too large to carry. Inside that bundle, folded carefully and protected from the worst of the desert's wrath, was a diary. And within its pages, Harold Lasseter spoke for the last time. The year was early 1931, when a recovery party, led by Bob Buck, a bushman hired to investigate Lasseter's disappearance, stumbled upon the site near the Hull River. They found signs of life once lived, an old tin billy, a crude shelter of sticks and branches, and the unmistakable silence of a place where something had ended. Near the shallow grave, they found the diary. Its pages were sun-warped but legible, written in Lasseter's distinct hand. What began as a record of a journey quickly unraveled into something else, a confessional, a testament, a window into the unraveling mind of a man caught between belief and desperation. The early entries were measured. Lasseter detailed his route, the behavior of his camels, his disagreements with Paul Johns. He noted the rising tension with practical clarity, observing how supplies were dwindling and morale was low. He made mention of the terrain, identifying familiar landmarks, or what he believed were familiar, and restated his conviction that the reef was close. But soon, the tone shifted. He described finally seeing it. The reef, the one he had sworn was real. There it was, he wrote, as I saw it all those years ago. He claimed the quartz was thick, the gold easily visible. He described a yellow gleam that caught the sun and refused to let go. He even drew crude sketches, rough, childlike outlines of rock faces and outcrops. Yet there was no sample, no proof. He blamed Johns, blamed the main expedition, blamed time and exhaustion, but mostly he wrote of fate, that he had been chosen, that he had found it not for himself, but for the nation. Australia will rise, he scribbled in one passage, when they find what I found. He became increasingly paranoid. One entry claimed that he had been misled by the stars. Another warned that people would try to steal the truth from him. There was talk of betrayal, of sabotage, of them, though he never clarified who they were. But among the madness, there were moments of piercing clarity. He wrote about his wife and children, wondering if they would understand. He expressed regret for his pride, sorrow for the pain he might have caused. Tell them I meant well, he wrote. Tell them I was right. One of the most haunting entries was simple, almost childlike in its cadence. The sun is too strong. I cannot think. I must stay in the shade. I have no water. I have no food, but I have hope. And later, as hope began to slip, I saw it. I swear, I saw it. There were no final words in the traditional sense. The last entry was dated loosely, the ink smudged, the handwriting shaking. It trailed off mid-sentence, as if the pen had simply fallen from his hand. The diary was taken back to Alice Springs, where it became a sensation. Newspapers ran excerpts. Radio programs recited his passages aloud. Public opinion divided sharply. Some saw it as proof, final confirmation that Lasseter had truly found the reef and died trying to bring its riches to light. Others dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man, evidence not of gold, but of sunstroke and delusion. The government, pressed for answers, sent additional parties to search the area Lasseter had described. None found a trace of gold. His sketches matched no known formations. His references were too vague. Even the so-called landmarks he named were either long gone or never existed to begin with. But the damage, or the inspiration, had already taken root. The diary became a relic, treated with near-religious reverence by some and skepticism by others. It was studied, copied, even dramatized. For those who believed, it was gospel. For those who doubted, it was fiction written by a man unraveled by the desert. What can be said for certain is this: the diary gave Lasseter's legend endurance. Without it, his story may have ended with a nameless grave in a remote corner of the country. But his words, desperate, poetic, defiant, gave fuel to a mystery that has never quite died. Even now, Nearly a century later, copies of the diary are passed between amateur prospectors and armchair historians. Some claim to have deciphered hidden meanings in the text, codes pointing to uncharted gullies or secret landmarks. Others pore over maps with faded red lines, drawn in imitation of the paths described within, but no one, not one person, has found what Lasseter claimed to see. The diary is a mirror. What you see in it reflects what you want to believe: faith, folly, greed, glory. And so the question lingers: did he really find it? Or did he simply believe so deeply that belief became indistinguishable from truth? Next, we turn to those who followed in his footsteps: dreamers, schemers, and seekers who, over the decades, gave their lives to chasing Lasseter's ghost through the dunes. Treasure hunters and dreamers. Harold Lasseter may have died in the desert, but his story did not. Like a campfire tale passed from mouth to mouth, it grew in the retelling, burnished by belief, darkened by skepticism, and brightened by the shimmer of gold just out of reach. His diary, filled with maddening vagueness and undeniable conviction, was enough to plant a seed. And once that seed took root, a new generation of adventurers, opportunists, and visionaries set out across the inland sands, chasing Lasseter's Reef as if chasing a ghost. The first to follow were men like Michael Terry, a respected explorer who led expeditions across Central Australia in the early 1930s. Terry, a rational man with a keen sense of the land, doubted the reef's existence but recognized the allure it held. His parties traced some of Lasseter's supposed routes, scouring ridgelines and creek beds with calculated patience. He found no gold, but his detailed journals mapped vast swathes of territory never properly charted before. In many ways, Terry's work helped transform the myth into a public obsession, not because he believed in the reef, but because his silence on its certainty left just enough room for hope. Others were less methodical and more fevered. A man named Ted Colson, one of the first Europeans to successfully cross the Simpson Desert, once admitted he had looked for the reef during his travels. He never found it, but the idea haunted him. "There's something out there," he once told a journalist. "I never found gold, but I saw where a man could vanish." Over the decades, dozens more came. Most were nameless: prospectors with battered utes and pickaxes, gray nomads who'd read about Lasseter in weekend magazines, young bushwalkers with dreams of striking it rich. They came with metal detectors, maps copied from the pages of Lasseter's diary, and stories told over decades around caravan parks and Outback pubs. Some of them believed completely. They studied every word of the diary, overlaid it with satellite images, compared it to geological surveys. They argued that Lasseter used code, that his diary contained cryptic clues, that government maps had been altered to protect the secret. For these believers, Lasseter was not a fool, he was a martyr. Others came with more flexible ethics. In the 1960s and 70s, reports began to surface of individuals offering Lasseter tours, paid expeditions where hopefuls were led into the outback by men claiming secret knowledge of the reef's location. Few of these guides were reputable. Most were clever bushmen or former prospectors spinning tales for city folk with wallets full of trust. But some truly believed, and more than a few vanished, swallowed by the desert they thought they could tame. Then came the dreamers who wanted more than gold. They wanted meaning. In the 1980s, a retired schoolteacher from South Australia spent over a year living out of a caravan in the desert, convinced that the reef was real and that Lasseter had left clues in the position of the stars. He believed the reef would only reveal itself under the right astronomical alignment, and he spent his days sketching constellations and marking alignments in the sand. When asked if he'd found anything, he smiled and said, "Maybe not gold, but I found peace." And perhaps that's what separated the treasure hunters from the true dreamers. The former came for riches. The latter came for something deeper, a connection to the story, to the silence, to the challenge of finding truth in a place where even the earth shifts beneath your feet. But the dream could also be dangerous. Over the decades, the Lasseter story claimed more than its share of casualties. Men went missing, bodies were found, vehicles abandoned in the scrub, maps pinned to dashboards, camps left half-packed, heat stroke, dehydration, misadventure. The causes were ordinary, but the context was always extraordinary. Each tragedy added another verse to the ballad of Lasseter, another whisper in the wind, another warning carved beneath the heat of the sun. The desert gives nothing for free. Some families of these lost souls have spoken of obsession, of fathers and brothers who grew increasingly distant, consumed by the idea that they were destined to find what no one else could. "He stopped talking about anything else," one woman said of her husband. "It was the reef, morning and night. I think he believed it would fix everything." In truth, the story of Lasseter's Reef became a kind of mirror. Those who looked into it saw what they wanted to see: redemption, wealth, validation, purpose. And the desert, silent and merciless, simply watched. Even in modern times, with GPS mapping and satellite imagery, the reef remains unfound. But that has not stopped new generations from searching. Entire websites and forums are dedicated to decoding Lasseter's diary. Amateur geologists publish long essays comparing mineral deposits across the Petermann Ranges. A few even claim the reef has already been found and hidden again, either by the government, by mining interests, or by indigenous custodians protecting sacred ground. These conspiracy theories rarely hold water. The reality, far less cinematic, is that the land is vast, harsh, and indifferent. If Lasseter ever did find something, it is now buried beneath time, sand, and myth. But still they come. Every few years someone picks up the story: a documentary crew, a podcaster, a man with a drone and a dream. They walk into the Outback with maps, sensors, and hope. And the desert, as always, remains unchanged. Next, we examine how this obsession moved beyond pickaxes and maps into books, films, and the cultural imagination of a nation. The legend grows. It began as a whisper in the red dust, a story told in country pubs and outback camps, passed between hands stained with engine grease and sweat. A man, they said, had found gold in the heart of the desert, not just flecks or traces, but a whole reef of it. Then he vanished, left behind nothing but a diary, a grave, and the biggest question the Outback had ever asked. But as the decades passed, Harold Lasseter's story did something few Outback yarns ever manage. It escaped the bush and entered the bloodstream of a nation. What had once been the obsession of prospectors and eccentrics began to weave itself into Australia's broader cultural mythology. And like all good legends, it changed shape as it traveled. In the 1940s, war and austerity pushed the reef to the back of public memory. But the story never quite died. It simmered, and in the post-war years, it came roaring back. By the 1950s, with new roads pushing deeper into the interior and Australians rediscovering their vast, unexplored centre, Lasseter's name began appearing in newspapers again. This time, it wasn't just news, it was entertainment. Books began to appear. One of the earliest was Fred Blakely's Dream Millions, published in the early 1930s shortly after the expedition. Blakely, who had led the original mission and clashed fiercely with Lasseter, painted the prospector as a deluded, possibly dishonest man. He belonged in a hospital, Blakely wrote, not the Outback. His account was scathing, and for some years it shaped the public's perception. Lasseter was either a fool or a fraud. But that narrative did not sit well with everyone. In the decades that followed, counter-narratives emerged. Writers re-examined Lasseter's diary, questioned Blakely's motives, and suggested that the true story was more complex, that Lasseter may have indeed found something. His death, they argued, was not a punchline, but a tragedy. By the 1970s, the Lasseter legend had taken firm hold in Australian pop culture. It began appearing in television specials, radio documentaries, and eventually film. Perhaps the most iconic portrayal came in the 1979 film The Legend of Lasseter, a documentary-style feature that combined reenactments with interviews and sweeping shots of the Outback. Narrated in somber tones, it leaned into the mystique, the lone visionary, the hostile land, the treasure that danced always just beyond reach. The film was a quiet hit, not a blockbuster, but a slow burn, the kind of story that sat in your mind long after the credits rolled. It helped frame Lasseter's journey, not as madness, but as myth, part of the great Australian narrative of endurance, belief, and the bush. Other works followed. Poets penned verses about the gold beneath the ghost gums. Musicians wrote bush ballads with names like Lasseter's Lament and The Reef That Shines at Night. Artists painted surreal interpretations of the reef. Some imagined it glowing in the starlight. Others showed it being swallowed by dunes. Even school curriculums began including references to Lasseter's Reef in lessons about exploration and myth-making. What made it resonate wasn't just the idea of gold. It was the character of Lasseter himself. He wasn't a polished hero. He wasn't even particularly likable. But he was us, flawed, hopeful, stubborn, a man with an idea he couldn't shake, and a country around him too big to care. His failure was almost more compelling than success. The Australian psyche has always carried a particular affection for the underdog, the loner, the battler. Lasseter fit that mold perfectly, and in a land defined as much by its silences as by its stories, he became both. By the turn of the 21st century, the legend had entered the digital age. Online forums sprang up, dedicated to decoding his diary, cross-referencing his vague landmarks with Google Earth imagery. Amateur sleuths posted YouTube videos from deep in the Outback, standing on windswept ridges and claiming, with nervous excitement, that they had found something, a quartz outcrop, a line of ironstone, a glimmer. Conspiracy theories flourished too. Some claimed the government had found the reef but kept it secret to preserve sacred Aboriginal land or avoid economic upheaval. Others said it had been mined quietly by foreign interests. A few believed Lasseter had never died at all, that his grave was a decoy and he had disappeared with the gold, living out his days in quiet luxury. These theories had little evidence, but plenty of passion. In the myth world, facts are optional. Belief is king. The reef became metaphor as much as mystery. Writers and philosophers began using it to describe the unattainable, that thing we chase all our lives, certain we're just one step away, only to realize the path has circled back on itself. The reef was ambition. The reef was hope. The reef was madness. Even in tourism, Lasseter's name became a calling card. A road, Lasseter Highway, now bears his name, connecting the Stuart Highway to Uluru. Thousands of tourists drive it each year, often unaware of the man behind the name. Some stop at roadside markers. Fewer still venture into the real heart of the country, where the story was born and, in some ways, still lives. In the end, Lasseter's legend has outlived the man, the expedition, and the gold. Whether the reef exists is now almost secondary. What matters is that people still care, still wonder, still look. Next, we explore the tension between this myth and a far older truth, the land itself and the people who have always known it. Indigenous memory and sacred lands. Long before Harold Lasseter wandered the desert with gold in his eyes, long before prospectors drew maps across central Australia, and long before Europeans even arrived on the continent, the land already had its keepers. It had its stories, its sacred places, its truths, passed down not through ink and parchment, but through song, ceremony, and spoken memory. To the western desert peoples, including the Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara, and Nganyatjara, the desert was never empty. It was alive. Every dune, every rocky outcrop, every dried-up creek bed was inscribed with meaning. These were not just physical features, but part of the dreaming, the ancestral lore that shaped the land and governed the people's relationship with it. When Harold Lasseter disappeared into the wilds of the Peterman and Rawlinson Ranges, he walked across land that had been known and understood for tens of thousands of years. Land that held sacred sites and stories far deeper than quartz veins and mineral surveys. But he did not know this, or if he did not listen. In his diary, Lasseter makes occasional references to natives, noting when he was helped, offered food, or guided. But like many of his time, he misunderstood or dismissed the deeper significance of those interactions. To him, the Aboriginal people he encountered were incidental, kind, yes, but peripheral. What he never saw was that he had entered not a void, but a cultural and spiritual domain. When the Pitjantjatjara people found him in his final days, they did what they could. They gave him water, shared what food they had, and observed his confusion with quiet concern. But they also understood something that Lasseter did not. The desert does not belong to anyone, it is the law. And when someone breaks that law, even unknowingly, the land responds. For the custodians of that region, the idea of a gold reef is not merely irrelevant, it is, in many ways, an affront. The very notion of carving the land open in search of riches runs counter to the principles of care, balance, and respect that underpin their worldview. The land is not there to be mined, it is there to be listened to. As Lasseter's legend grew, so too did the tension between myth and memory. In the mid-20th century, as interest in the reef surged, prospectors began seeking access to lands held under Aboriginal title. Some even trespassed into restricted areas, believing they were following Lasseter's trail. Others sought to enlist Aboriginal guides, hoping that traditional knowledge might point them toward the reef. But these efforts largely failed, not because the knowledge was lacking, but because the premise was wrong. The reef, if it existed at all, had no place in the dreaming. It was not part of the songlines. It had no spirit name or ceremonial role. It was a foreign idea in an ancient world. Still, the people remembered. Elders passed down accounts of a strange white man who came walking alone, thin and sunburnt, speaking of gold and asking for directions. They remembered the cave where he sheltered. They remembered the smell of sickness on his skin, the way he muttered to the trees. They remembered how he refused to turn back. Some stories told of a man so obsessed that he ignored the warnings of the land itself. Others were more compassionate. They saw him as lost, both physically and spiritually, and tried to help him find his way home. In the decades that followed, Indigenous leaders began speaking more openly about the need to protect these sacred areas from exploitation. As land rights campaigns gained traction in the 1970s and 80s, the Lasseter story became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when you enter country with greed instead of respect. In some circles, there was quiet frustration with how the legend had been framed. Why was the story of a lost prospector treated as sacred, while the dreaming stories of the land's true custodians were sidelined or ignored? Why did newspapers and filmmakers elevate Lasseter to the status of martyr, while Aboriginal knowledge, which had preserved life in the desert for millennia, was treated as folklore? It is only in more recent years that this imbalance has begun to shift. Younger generations of Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, are now more aware of the deep cultural significance of the Western Desert. Documentaries exploring Lasseter's Reef increasingly include Aboriginal voices, placing the story within the broader context of colonization, cultural erasure, and resilience. In one powerful interview, a Pitjantjatjara elder said simply, "The land remembers, even when men forget." Today, parts of the region Lasseter once wandered are protected under Indigenous land use agreements. Access is regulated. Sacred sites are off-limits to outsiders. And while a few stubborn prospectors still chase the ghost of the reef, most now understand that the land is not theirs to conquer. Perhaps the real treasure Lasseter missed was not gold, but wisdom, the kind passed in silence between generations, carried in song, in smoke, in stone. A wisdom that knew the desert would always outlast the dreams of those who failed to see its soul. Next, we trace the broader context of gold fever in Australia and how Lasseter's tale echoed the boomtown dreams that once swept the continent. Gold fever in the Outback. Before Harold Lasseter set foot in the desert with a dream in his pocket, Australia was already a land gripped by gold fever. It began in the mid-19th century with a few flecks of yellow metal in the rivers of New South Wales. By the time the century was out, gold had reshaped the continent. Towns had sprung from nothing. Fortunes were made overnight. And the Australian identity, rugged, bold, and luck-chasing, had begun to crystallize around the gleam of a miner's pan. The first major gold rush kicked off in the year 1851 near Bathurst in New South Wales. Within months, the word was out. Ships flooded into Sydney Harbour. Labourers, merchants, and adventurers poured into the bush. They came from Ireland, China, California, and every corner of the British Empire. The goldfields became chaotic, multicultural hubs filled with tents, makeshift stores, and the ceaseless sound of shovels in dirt. Soon after, gold was found in Victoria. Ballarat and Bendigo boomed. In less than a decade, Victoria alone was producing more gold than any other place on Earth. The colony's population exploded. Melbourne, once a sleepy outpost, became one of the richest cities in the world. This era left deep marks on the national psyche. The myth of the digger was born here, not just a miner, but a symbol of egalitarian spirit, mateship, and gritty resolve. Gold made people rich, yes, but it also made them believe that Australia was a place where fate could turn in an instant, that anyone, no matter their start in life, might strike it lucky. But gold rushes were not without their shadows. Environmental damage was widespread. Rivers were choked with silt and mercury. Hills were gouged open. Entire landscapes were reshaped. There were also bitter clashes between European miners and Chinese migrants, as well as violent conflicts with Aboriginal communities whose lands were being trampled and torn apart. By the turn of the 20th century, the easy gold was mostly gone. The rivers had been picked clean. Shallow diggings were exhausted. But the hunger for gold, for the miracle of sudden wealth, had not faded. it simply moved inland. In Western Australia, a series of late 19th century strikes reignited the fever. Coolgardie, Kalgoorlie, and Menzies rose out of the dust like fever dreams. The goldfields were harsher than those of the East, dry, remote, and deadly, but they drew men by the thousands. Some made fortunes, others vanished without a trace. This was the world Lasseter was born into. By the early 1900s, the dream of a lost reef wasn't new. Tales of hidden gold seams, secret valleys, and unclaimed fortune were common. Every old prospector had a story of someone who'd seen something just once and never found it again. Most of these tales faded like dust in the wind, but Lasseter's did not. Why? Because his story arrived at a time when the fever was meant to be over. The nation was no longer chasing pickaxes and pans. It was building cities, laying telegraph lines, forging a modern identity. But then came the Great Depression, and suddenly the idea of lost gold didn't seem so quaint. It seemed essential. For a population reeling from job losses, bank closures, and shattered futures, Lasseter's Reef was a lifeline, not just a myth, a maybe. The belief that somewhere out there, buried under red sand and time, lay a motherlode big enough to change everything. The government, newspapers, and investors leaned into that hope. Expeditions were funded, maps were redrawn. Men with little experience and great expectations loaded up trucks and camels and marched into the unknown. Gold fever, it seemed, had returned, not with crowds and fanfare, but with quiet, obsessive urgency. The psychology of it was familiar. The desert offered a blank slate. It promised nothing but allowed everything. In the Outback, there were no boundaries between legend and truth. If you believed hard enough and walked far enough, who could say what you might find? It was this blend of history, desperation, and myth that made Lasseter's story so potent. He wasn't just chasing gold, he was chasing Australian gold, the kind steeped in national identity, echoing with the voices of Ballarat and Bendigo, tinged with the red dust of the inland. His reef wasn't just valuable, it was symbolic. Over the years, comparisons between Lasseter and earlier gold pioneers became common. Some likened him to Edward Hargraves, the man credited with the first discovery of gold in New South Wales. Others called him a bush Ned Kelly, misunderstood, defiant, doomed. Even when the facts didn't fit, the sentiment did. And just as the original rushes had shaped towns and politics, Lasseter's tale began shaping something more elusive: imagination. Outback pubs bore his name. Tourist brochures leaned on the mystery. Folk songs were sung beside campfires about the man who chased a golden dream too far. And every few years, another headline would appear: "New search begins for lost gold reef." Always the same promise. Always the same silence from the desert. Today, gold mining in Australia is a high-tech global industry. Companies drill with lasers and map with satellites. They don't follow whispers, they follow data. But even now, among the algorithms and aeromagnetic surveys, there's room for the irrational, the one that got away, the reef that won't die. In that sense, Lasseter's Reef remains the final echo of a fever that once shook the continent. Next, we examine what science has to say, and whether the Earth itself could ever hide the kind of treasure Lasseter described. The Geology of Hope. Hope, when buried deep enough, can resemble truth. That is what makes Lasseter's story so enduring. Not just the man or the myth, but the idea that somewhere, hidden beneath the searing red earth of Central Australia, lies a reef of gold so rich, so unimaginable, that it defies every known rule of geology. But is such a thing even possible? To answer that, we must set aside the romance of the Outback for a moment and dig into the facts, the real, gritty, scientific bones of the continent. Australia is old, not just by human measure, but by geological time. The rocks that form the heart of the continent are some of the oldest exposed formations on Earth. The Pilbara Craton in Western Australia, for example, contains rocks dating back more than 3.5 billion years. This immense age means the continent has seen it all: volcanic upheavals, ancient seas, continental collisions, and millennia of erosion that have left behind vast deposits of minerals. Gold, as a result, is plentiful in certain parts of the land. Australia remains one of the world's leading gold producers, with major fields concentrated in Victoria, Western Australia, and parts of New South Wales and Queensland. These regions share something important: favorable geology. Specifically, they lie along known mineral belts, areas where geological conditions over millions of years created the right pressure, temperature, and chemical mix to allow gold to accumulate in economically viable quantities. The key word there is viable. Gold may be present in many places, but to be worth mining, it must appear in enough concentration, typically in quartz veins, within host rocks such as granite or greenstone, and in places where tectonic activity once forced mineral-rich fluids into fractures beneath the Earth's crust. Which brings us to Central Australia and to Lasseter's fabled Reef. The area he described lies within the Musgrave Province, a vast region that stretches across the borderlands of the Northern Territory, South Australia, and Western Australia. It is remote, arid, and sparsely populated. The landscape is dominated by weathered ranges, ancient metamorphic rocks, and long tracts of desert plains. Geologists have studied the Musgrave Block extensively over the last century. It is certainly complex, home to Proterozoic rocks more than 1 billion years old and marked by deep crustal faults. There is even some mineralization in the region: copper, nickel, platinum group elements. But gold? Not in the quantities Lasseter described. Small traces of gold have been found here and there, enough to interest junior exploration companies perhaps, but not enough to suggest a massive, continuous reef stretching for kilometers. The geological environment simply does not support the kinds of fluid pathways and structural settings that are typically associated with large gold deposits. Lasseter claimed the reef ran for many miles, with veins of quartz, a man's arm wide, laced with visible gold. Such formations do exist, but almost always in areas with a history of significant tectonic and hydrothermal activity. The goldfields of Kalgoorlie or Ballarat fit that model. The Petermann Ranges do not. And then there's the matter of the reef's apparent disappearance. Gold-bearing quartz does not simply vanish. Even under deep sand, it leaves geophysical signatures. It can be detected with magnetics, radiometrics, or satellite imagery. In the last few decades, exploration companies have used such technologies to map even the most remote parts of Central Australia. Still, no sign of the reef has ever been found, which leads many experts to a simple conclusion. The reef, as described, does not exist. But here's where geology meets psychology. It is entirely plausible that Lasseter saw something. Central Australia is filled with quartz outcrops, some strikingly large, some quite beautiful. Under the right light, with the sun low and the rocks still warm, even iron-rich veins can glint yellow. He may have seen mica, pyrite, fool's gold, or oxidized surfaces that shimmer like treasure. Add heat stroke, fatigue, and isolation, and the mind can turn a shimmer into a fortune. There's also the question of misremembering. Lasseter claimed to have first seen the reef as a young man, decades before his final journey. The Outback is not kind to memory. Landmarks shift, rivers dry, sand dunes migrate. A place that seemed unmistakable in youth could be impossible to relocate later in life. Some theorists have suggested that Lasseter may have confused locations, that the reef he saw was actually in a different range altogether, perhaps the Rawlinson Ranges to the west, or even in a completely separate geological zone. But even these theories lack hard evidence. Of course, not everyone is convinced by the geologists. Some amateur prospectors argue that modern science cannot account for every anomaly, that unexplored pockets of the interior still hold secrets, that the very vastness of Australia means something could still be hidden, especially if buried beneath meters of sand or weathered stone. It's true that geology, while precise, is never absolute. New discoveries happen, deposits are missed, but the more we understand about the Earth's ancient story, the clearer the picture becomes. If Lasseter's Reef exists, it is unlike any known gold deposit in Australia, and possibly the world. Which brings us back to hope, because that, more than quartz or gold, is what has kept this story alive. The belief that there is something out there, something massive, secret, and waiting, continues to pull people into the desert. It has survived droughts, science, and reason. It lives in the hearts of those who, map in hand, still walk into the sand, believing they might be the one to find what all others missed. Next, we step away from theories and return to the harsh reality of the desert, a place that has claimed not just Lasseter, but many others who followed his path into the silence. The desert takes its toll. There is a certain kind of silence that only the Outback can give you. It is not the absence of sound, not entirely, but something deeper, a weight in the air, a stillness that sits behind every breeze, every bird call, every creak of the spinifex. It is a silence that listens back. Those who come into the desert chasing gold, whether Lasseter's Reef or any other whisper of fortune, quickly learn that this silence does not welcome everyone. It watches, and sometimes it takes. From the moment Lasseter's story became national news, the desert began to tally a new set of losses. He was not the first to perish in the Outback, nor the last, but his tale opened a door that others walked through, some with maps and compasses, others with dreams and nothing more. They came in all shapes: rugged prospectors, thrill seekers, conspiracy theorists, even scholars. Some came with trucks filled with supplies and high-tech equipment. Others arrived with little more than a swag, a copy of Lasseter's diary, and an unshakable belief that they alone could finish the journey he had started. Some made it out, many did not. The names of those who followed are scattered through police reports, newspaper clippings, and the fading memories of old Outback towns. Most are barely remembered. A few became cautionary tales. In the 1950s, a former soldier named John Armstrong vanished after telling friends he had decoded clues in Lasseter's diary and was heading into the Rawlinson Ranges. His vehicle was found abandoned weeks later. No trace of Armstrong was ever recovered. In the 1970s, a group of amateur gold hunters from Melbourne set out in 2 vehicles to search an area they believed matched Lasseter's description. One truck broke down. Supplies ran low. By the time they were found, one man was dead from dehydration, and the others were barely clinging to life. They had wandered less than 20 kilometers from their vehicle. Close, yet so far. Then there are the stories less dramatic, but just as telling. Hikers who underestimate the heat, campers who misjudge their location, well-meaning tourists drawn in by the romanticism of the Lasseter legend. Even today, Search and rescue operations are launched every year across the central deserts, many sparked by nothing more than a misplaced step or a faulty GPS. The desert is not cruel, but it is indifferent. Temperatures in the central interior routinely soar above 45 degrees Celsius in the summer months. Water sources are scarce and often seasonal. Mobile reception is unreliable. Tracks vanish beneath the wind. A day's journey on foot can become fatal in hours if the sun is high and your canteen is dry. And then there is the psychological toll. The Outback has a way of peeling away the layers. Out here, without noise or comfort or the distractions of the modern world, your thoughts grow louder. For those chasing something as elusive as a lost reef of gold, that solitude can become obsession. The line between belief and delusion begins to blur, just as it did for Lasseter. Many who went in search of the reef began their journeys hopeful, even euphoric. They quoted the diary, studied rock formations, compared maps, but weeks in the desert wore them down. Blisters became infected, dust clogged lungs, vehicles failed, and slowly the gold they chased began to shimmer like a mirage, always just ahead, never quite there. Some turned back, others kept going, believing that the next ridge, the next dune, the next dry creek bed would reveal everything. For some, it revealed nothing but the void. It wasn't just individuals who suffered. Families too were affected. Wives and children left behind. Savings spent on equipment and fuel. Lives upended by a single belief, that Lasseter had been right. He never came back, one woman told a journalist in the 1980s. But he believed in it, more than he believed in us. The government, at various points, considered issuing public advisories about solo expeditions into remote regions. In some areas, permits were required. But it was difficult to regulate obsession. If a man wanted to walk into the desert with nothing but a dream, there was often little anyone could do to stop him. And yet, for all this, the search has never truly stopped. In recent years, satellite imagery and drone surveys have allowed safer exploration. Searchers now travel with EPIRBs, emergency beacons, and lightweight solar-powered GPS units. But the core impulse remains the same. The belief that somewhere, beneath rock and time, lies the one thing everyone missed. Ironically, the harshness of the desert may be the very thing that has preserved the myth. If Lasseter's reef were said to lie in a forest or mountain, it might have been disproven by now. But the desert is vast, deceptive. It holds its secrets tightly. There are, of course, those who argue that the deaths and disappearances are not the fault of the land, but of the legend itself. That Lasseter's story, for all its mystery, has lured good people into places they were not prepared to go. That the dream of gold has blinded people to the risk. But perhaps it is more complicated than that. Perhaps the toll the desert takes is the price we pay not just for treasure, but for meaning, for testing the edge of what we think is possible, for walking into a place that cares nothing for us and seeing if we come back out the same. Next, we explore how modern technology, from satellites to drones, has changed the game and whether the answers we seek may finally be within reach. Modern expeditions and technology. Time has not dimmed the shimmer of Lasseter's reef. If anything, the march of progress has only sharpened the tools of those who continue to search. The romance of the Outback, once navigated by camel and compass, now unfolds beneath satellites and high-resolution screens. But the question remains, has technology brought us any closer to uncovering the truth? The answer is layered, much like the desert itself. Since the early 2000s, technological advances have transformed mineral exploration in Australia. What once took months by foot can now be scanned from space. Satellite imagery, LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and hyperspectral analysis allow geologists to detect subtle differences in vegetation, soil color, and geological formations, indicators that can suggest the presence of mineralization beneath the surface. One of the key tools used in the modern hunt for Lasseter's Reef is remote sensing. Satellites equipped with multispectral scanners orbit above, capturing data invisible to the human eye. Geologists and prospectors alike use these images to search for anomalies, places where the rocks or soil reflect light in unusual ways, hinting at quartz, ironstone, or even gold-bearing minerals. These technologies have been instrumental in locating many of the country's more recent mineral deposits. But even the best satellites cannot peer through time. The Red Centre is a deceptive landscape. What may look like a consistent terrain from above can be wildly varied on foot. Sand dunes shift. Vegetation changes with the seasons. Rock formations weather and crumble. A landmark visible in one decade may be gone the next. And if Lasseter's coordinates, assuming he ever had them, were wrong by even a few degrees, modern scans could miss the mark entirely. Ground-based exploration has also taken a leap forward. Drones now buzz quietly across the desert, capturing high-resolution imagery of inaccessible gorges and ridgelines. They can fly programmed routes, scan for heat signatures, and even carry miniature magnetometers to detect metallic anomalies in the earth below. Some expeditions use drone data to create detailed 3D maps, comparing them with descriptions from Lasseter's diary, trying to match poetic phrases to physical places. Handheld tech has evolved too. Prospectors now rely on advanced metal detectors, portable X-ray fluorescence scanners, and geolocation systems accurate to within centimeters. Where Lasseter once scrawled in a notebook, today's explorers can log coordinates and rock chemistry instantly on a tablet. One of the most ambitious modern efforts to locate Lasseter's Reef came in the early 2000s, led by a team of amateur researchers and former mining engineers from Queensland. They pooled resources to purchase satellite data, historical maps, and mineral survey results from Geoscience Australia. They plotted possible paths Lasseter might have taken, including the lesser-traveled southern routes near the Docker River region. They flew drones over narrow canyons. They followed creek beds thought to have been described in the diary. They camped for weeks at a time. And what did they find? Quartz, a lot of it, but no gold. Their conclusion was cautious. The region was not geologically favorable for large-scale gold deposits, they said, but neither could they rule it out entirely. They noted that quartz outcrops in the area could easily be misinterpreted by someone without formal training, especially under the strain of heat stroke and dehydration. Their final report was detailed, well-structured, and in many ways anticlimactic. No reef, no revelation, just a careful reaffirmation that the mystery endures. Yet for every data-driven skeptic, there is still a believer. Some argue that the technology has been misapplied, that the reef's location lies not in the region typically searched, but farther west or even north. Others claim that new tech has actually spotted the reef, but governments or mining companies have suppressed the findings to avoid environmental or political conflict. Such theories are hard to prove and harder to disprove. The desert, with its vast silence, offers few clues either way. There are also efforts to digitize Lasseter's original materials. Scans of his diary, letters, and maps are now available online through academic institutions and archive projects. Modern-day searchers can cross-reference his words with satellite data in real time, looking for any match between his descriptions and current geography. But there's a deeper irony in this digital age. The more precise the tools, the more elusive the story becomes. Lasseter's account was never technical, it was poetic. He described the reef not with coordinates, but with feelings. The look of the hills, the direction of the sun, the gleam that would not leave. How do you quantify that? How do you plug longing into a GPS? Technology may make the desert more navigable, but it does not necessarily make it more knowable. Even today, well-equipped expeditions return from the interior with the same story. A few hopeful samples, a few strange rock formations, and a lingering sense that something remains, just out of reach. Some suggest that, even if Lasseter's reef is never found, the tools we've developed in searching for it have brought broader benefits. Remote sensing used in these quests has contributed to ecological surveys, archaeological mapping, and even wildfire modeling. In chasing gold, we've sometimes stumbled into knowledge, but the heart of the matter remains unresolved. Has modern technology disproven Lasseter's story? Not exactly. Has it confirmed it? Not at all. It has only widened the lens, showing us more land, more variables, and more reasons to wonder. Next, we reflect on the legacy of this legend, what it says about Australia, about belief, and about a man who died with nothing but conviction in his hands. Lasseter's legacy. In the red stillness of Australia's interior, where the sun bleaches bones and time folds like rock strata, a man once walked into the desert and never walked back out. His name was Harold Lasseter, and what he left behind, a diary, a grave, and a glint of something more, has never stopped echoing. His legacy is not simple. It's not even entirely his. Like the gold he sought, it has been reshaped, hammered, and burnished by the passage of years. It is a legacy layered in myth, suspicion, reverence, and regret. To some, Lasseter was a visionary, a man decades ahead of his time, a prophet of quartz and red dust who saw what others could not, and paid for it. His diary, in this telling, is gospel. His reef, though still hidden, is as real as the sun-scorched spinifex. They see him not as a failed prospector, but as a fallen hero, one who was ignored, mocked, and ultimately abandoned by those who should have believed. To others, he was a fantasist, a man who blurred memory with desire, a skilled speaker, perhaps even a compulsive liar, who led an expedition into ruin with nothing but a half-remembered tale and an unyielding pride. In this view, Lasseter's legacy is cautionary, a reminder of the dangers of obsession and the thin line between inspiration and delusion, and perhaps he was both, a man with the conviction of a prophet, but the proof of a dreamer. What is certain is that he became a symbol, not just of a lost treasure, but of something deeper. In a land forged by extremes, where droughts last years and fortunes vanish overnight, Lasseter became a kind of everyman, vulnerable, hopeful, doomed. His story contains the threads of many others: the lonely bushman, the stubborn outsider, the visionary who couldn't fit into the world as it was. It's a narrative that sits comfortably beside those of Ned Kelly, Burke and Wills, and the battlers of Gallipoli, flawed men, broken by something bigger than themselves, but elevated in death to something nearly sacred. But Lasseter's legacy is not just in books and documentaries. It lives in place. The Lasseter Highway stretches through the Northern Territory, linking the Stuart Highway to the edge of Uluru. Every day, thousands of tourists drive along it, unaware of the man for whom it is named. A man who, unlike them, had no guidebook, no petrol station, no cold water at the end of the road. There is also Lasseter's Cave, a shallow rock shelter near the Hull River, where he is believed to have taken refuge during his final days. Today, it is marked with a plaque, a signpost, and a well-worn track. Visitors leave offerings, coins, notes, pebbles, a strange, quiet pilgrimage to a man who died in pursuit of something he could never quite hold. More than a few of those who visit feel something, not a presence perhaps, but a weight, the sense that they're standing not at a tourist stop, but at the edge of a story that refuses to die. In academic circles, Lasseter's tale is studied as an example of modern myth-making, how a single man's account, however unproven, can grip a nation's imagination. Historians dissect his timeline. Psychologists analyze his motivations. Writers turn him into metaphor. And in mining forums and backcountry pubs, the debate still flickers. Was the reef real? Is it still out there? Some say yes. Some swear they've seen it. From the air, from a ridge, in a dream. Others believe the reef has been found and covered up, that it lies under sacred ground, protected, or that the desert has swallowed it as it swallows everything. But more often, Lasseter's reef is spoken of with something softer than belief, longing. A longing not just for gold, but for purpose, for something vast and untouchable, something you could spend your whole life chasing and never quite reach, and yet be glad for the chase. Because that is what Lasseter gave us, whether he meant to or not. Not gold, not glory, but the chase. The idea that somewhere out there, just beyond the horizon, lies something worth walking into the wilderness for. Something that makes you brave the heat, the silence, the doubt. Something that might never be found, but should never be forgotten. And so the legacy endures. In sandstone ridges and cracked leather journals, in satellite maps and Outback yarns, in empty tracks where a single set of footprints disappears into the dust. Harold Lasseter walked into the desert chasing gold. What he found was legend, farewell message. And so, dear listener, our journey through the silence and legend of the Australian Outback comes to an end. We have walked beside Harold Lasseter, felt the heat that beat down on his final days, and listened to the whisper of gold that never quite fell silent. Whether you believe in the reef or not, one truth remains. Some stories are worth remembering, not because they were proven, but because they dared to reach beyond reason. Thank you for sharing this hour with me, for walking through dust and time, myth and memory. I hope you found a little wonder in the journey, and maybe, like Lasseter, something worth chasing in your own heart. If you enjoyed this tale, please tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this to life, slow, thoughtful, and just strange enough to keep you dreaming. Until next time, sleep well, travel far, and never stop searching. Good night.